By the way, I was reading some of the rest of what was in OPAR, and it said something like there's two basic motivations, motivation by love and fear. And that sort of answered at least according to that, every action must be motivated and therefore must have an emotion behind it. But it made me think about how it's actually quite hard to, part of the process of forming the concepts or thinking about them properly is observing yourself and looking around and going, what do I feel now? That's not always easy to answer. That's pretty hard sometimes. So it made me think about that, but it was just relevant to our discussion last time. And then it seems like, from what I'm getting my head around so far, there's nothing this theory of concept formation is new, and it validates knowledge. It validates concepts explicitly, but a lot of ideas we formed before this as well, the Industrial Revolution happened before this. Darwin, who else? Newton. So then when it comes to actually improving thinking, it seems like that's not really what philosophy does. Philosophy just gives you some basic fundamentals, okay, concepts are valid, use reason. You wouldn't have come to that conclusion if it weren't for the Industrial Revolution, but use reason, there's some virtues, but the actual process of improving thinking seems like it seems like that's more about just being observant and using your memory than it is anything else, and asking questions. I was thinking about that, my answer in improving thinking isn't necessarily in philosophy.
It's partly true. I think you have a point, but that was one of the things I was going to bring up, something kind of related to that idea. So you're saying that, philosophy gives you the principles and you can apply them, but getting better at thinking isn't necessarily part of philosophy. That's what you're interpreting, right? Or that's the way you're looking at it, right?
Yeah, I'm saying maybe the exception would be training yourself to think in examples, like we're doing with okay, the basics. Okay, this is how you think, but it's really basic, right? It's nothing beyond that. It's literally just when you're forming a concept or when you're trying to clarify things in your mind, use examples and look for similarities and differences between examples. But that, as far as guidance goes, that's kind of it. So I'm saying that the legwork is elsewhere. It's not in philosophy.
I would distinguish that from, maybe some philosophies are that way, but I would distinguish that from, say, any type of normative question, whether that's rationality. Irrationality would be a common concept to many philosophies, even if they disagree on what rationality is. There's some standard of rationality that things must meet, and you could almost say there's part of philosophy could be the study of the efficient and proper way of conceptualizing things. That efficiency is implied in it. That if you're going to think in an ideal state and to recommend what those, or to say what that is at the same time to say a recommendation of how to think. You're saying if rational thinking is, say, properly organized concepts, the implication of that is your thinking will improve. If that is true, that it's part of proper thinking. And the only question is, how do you get there? But as far as answering, is it to help you think? Yes. Part of the claim is that this is a most effective and efficient way to organize concepts. Or at least, and under any philosophy where rationality is part of it, they're always saying that there's an ideal or proper way of functioning, and there's an improper way of functioning. And so if you identify what is the proper way of functioning, then by following those functions, you will think better.
Right. So you're saying, from what I got, okay, so we obviously lay out a basic groundwork. I know it's not basic; it's incredibly difficult, but on some level, it is fundamental. It's not, we're not getting into details of what questions do you ask in order to finish this thought process or whatever. Maybe actually around specific issues in philosophy, like in virtue, like how should one live and that kind of thing. Um, I'm just thinking of, okay, maybe another way for me to phrase it. You're saying is that what you're saying is basically that philosophy, because it is teaching you something very fundamental, which is how to think, which is doesn't come automatically, and that if anything, it'll at least help you think to your potential. Would you say that's a...
Yeah, or at least Ayn Rand would argue that's her approach, that rationality is, we identify rationality as the way man ought to function, the way the way to function by his nature. And
Right.
functioning by his nature implies like not only just thinking, but thinking properly, thinking rightly. That is uh, acquiring truth or finding out what is true. So
Yeah.
by that standard, you're saying there's a right way to get at truth and a wrong way. And by
Yeah.
Rand's theory, that the right way is and means that your concepts are easier to access. It's easier to think through things. Your ideas are clearer. So by identifying what the requirements of rationality are, if you follow them, you will think better. We might get into
Right.
more detailed questions of how exactly do you train it? How exactly do you spend your time or divide your training or whatever it is? But there are principles, and the better thinking is you use the principles. The only question is how do you use them or how do you acquire them?
Actually, now that you say that, I'm rethinking my previous thought. You're right. Like, I guess there's always the non-volitional aspect. So like the thing I had in mind, and I sort of ignored the fact that, okay, now I am on some fundamental level completely trying to change the way I think about everything. Ignoring that, I just thought of the fact that when I was walking around, I was like, well, for me to like, because I was making a comment to myself about something. I was like, that seems a bit stylistic or whatever. And then I'm like, what is stylistic? And I couldn't, it was so vague. And I was like, all right, well, in order for me to form a concept, or to validate it or to really be clear, I need to be, it's like, I need to be picking up on like very subtle shades of, similarities and differences in reality, like in pictures, with people, in actions, and not necessarily in one go. Sometimes it's going to be, dispersed out over like 5 observations over like 4 months. And so then that comes down to memory. And I thought, well, it just seems like so much of it is that observation of similarities and differences is like some of it is volitional, but a lot of it seems to be not. And then on top of that, like then I combine that with, well, even before we had Ito, like people were forming concepts, and we had the Industrial Revolution. And so that's why I was thinking, well, it seems like there's a limited impact. But I take what you're saying as, yeah, maybe it's hard to measure though, right? Like you don't know. It's hard to measure the impact it has, but I think you're right. Like, okay, yeah, it tries to maximize your ability to think to your potential. We'll go with that.
At least under objectivism that tries to define things in terms of rationality, that's the way objectivists would answer it. I think some people might, like a utilitarian might argue a different way. They might have
What
a
do you
different,
mean?
like utilitarian would just argue in terms of like just merely what is practical. And usually it might have to do with like concepts are just a way of well, maybe that's not a good example because even utilitarians I would argue like economy of concepts are important. I guess I was thinking more like, say some people believe in moral intuition, that the grounding of intuition is our just whatever intuitive feelings we have, and that's the only basis you could have. And so their basis, like, it's yeah, it probably would be true that this way of thinking about concepts really doesn't do much for their moral theory, so it might not be as relevant to them, and they might be right saying, yeah, there isn't. That's a completely separate issue. That it doesn't matter for our ethics what it is, how our concepts are organized, because it's based on intuition. So as far as that goes, better thinking isn't necessarily anything
Got
that
it.
philosophy does.
Well,
But of course,
religion is
under
a a good
Well,
example?
intuitionism could be, well, there's all types of ways you can be a moral intuitionist. I mean, I would just look up the term and see who there is. I mean, there's one famous guy, A.J. Ayers, but he argues more in terms of like moral intuitions or just like those feelings you have, like that's good or that's bad, and all morality is based on that kind of feeling. So he wouldn't be used to like, he wouldn't be talking about like efficiency of thinking. Like it would be irrelevant.
Right. Okay. So you're saying this is something, it makes sense. You're saying thinking well and I mean, thinking well in every area of your life. So for work too, it would apply to every area, relationships. This is something that objectivism stresses more so than a lot of other philosophies.
Yes,
And
that's what I'm
so,
saying.
yeah, okay, got it. And okay, yeah, I mean, I think of religion, which I grew up with. So that's true. Like, what, so then, when I think of, the way I define thought was a self-initiated, um, it's like self-initiated mental activity where you ask yourself questions. That's what I've got so far. And then, so if I'm asking myself questions, what, what else? There's obviously, to think properly seems to be deeper than that, right? That thinking is to ask yourself questions, but then if we're saying that objectivism helps you think properly, then what is the added? Is it like, yeah? What is the added? What's the added element there?
Well, rationality, when you say
Um,
rational thought.
uh, I'm not sure. Isn't rationality just exercising your reason, which is asking questions anyway?
Um, well, if we understand reason as, say, the faculty of reason, as in the man's means of survival, when we conceptualize it that way, it's not just that you're asking questions. It's a, we're identifying as a method of thought.
Right.
It's not. It's more than just a thought or an idea or emotion. It's a method of thinking.
Okay. How? Well, the one thing actually I'm missing, if we're talking about rationality, it's that whole description of moving from sensations to percepts to concepts, and then what are concepts and how do you form them is important for someone who doesn't form them properly or think about them properly. Maybe that.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
if, of course, if your concepts were automatically formed correctly, there would be no need for rationality. It would just be,
right.
I don't know, just perception, or what you want to call it. It's just, it'd be immediate. There was no method necessary. It just appears correct.
Right.
So this is just trying to say that there's right methods and there's wrong methods. People may think in all kinds of ways, but if we're talking about thinking in a normative sense, like as in how ought one think, or what is necessary to find truth or find true knowledge, or whatever term you want to use, whatever method we need to do that, it it's something we have to seek out. I mean, that's how we ought to function, not just it's a way to function.
Yeah. Although the basic there's some basic method, because otherwise, it's not like no one was thinking before Ayn Rand and then people started thinking. Like there's definitely some basic, well, I guess I'm trying to get at, like, what is the basic constituent of being able to think? Just seems to be asking questions and then finding contradictions, and that's it, right? Like,
Okay, I follow
would
that.
you say that's,
Like what's before rationality is kind of what you're asking,
I don't know if
or
I'm
what's
not thinking about it that way, but I'm just like
even the
the
genus of it.
core of being able to think. Yeah. Okay. You tell me. Yeah. The
Probably
genus of
genus of
Rush.
it sounds weird. Thinking like, what is it? What is the broader category? I mean, this is a bit tricky. So, I mean, we would widen it to like, well, mental activity, but that's not quite enough. I mean, it would seem like there's something more broad than just rationality. Like, I mean, are you only thinking if you're rational, and otherwise you're not thinking? Like, that wouldn't make sense either. Like, even if you're irrational thoughts, you're still thinking. It's still a thought. I would almost wonder if there is no other condition. It's just you're either thinking rationally or you're not. And anything above that is just mental activity. Like,
I don't follow. I think rationality is just exercising reason, right? Which is that's basically thinking. Like, but I
yeah,
guess maybe where I'm getting lost is you can think properly and you can also think like an example of thinking improperly, which I would do a lot of, is thinking in propositions that do not have clear concepts. But I wouldn't have even thought about that had I not read this book, right? But
yeah,
my so that's one observation. But the other thing is obviously like people have thought properly before there's any of this stuff that has been put in theory in explicit terms. Anyway, maybe I don't have a solid question there and I need to think it over a bit more, but just something I was thinking about was like, I mean, this all just comes back to, I was thinking like, okay, it gives you some basic guidance, but the actual, like, whatever it takes to think really well seems to be, I don't know if it's necessarily answered in philosophy.
I think what I'm thinking about is perhaps any thought implies. Well, I would wonder first if people generally strive to be rational. However we define it, even if before they knew what it was, I think people generally try to go at what is true and find the way to find it. They look
Yeah.
for the best rational procedure and they don't know what it is and they might fail to use it. And there's a degree to which you can use it. You could use certain aspects of it. You can use some parts of rational thought, like asking questions. You at least got one thing and you're doing something a little rational. And there's more ways to think rationally. But it's a method either way. And then you can just characterize your thoughts as either rational or not. But I don't think you can have thoughts that aren't one or the other. Like I don't think there's any in between state. Like either it's striving to find truth in some way, or you're developing your belief as best as you can to coincide with truth in the way reality is, or you're making no attempt, or you might separate like degrees, like you're not trying very hard, like you're thinking with emotions, like you're just making associations, and you would probably call that irrational because it's not an attempt at objective identification or an attempt at cognition. You're just attempting at emotion, like, or you might say it's irrational. That has nothing to do with rationality. It's just, I don't know, a feeling, an impulse, or whatever you want to call it. So I just contrasted like you have irrational, rational, and irrational, where it doesn't really do either.
Okay. So what would you, I didn't quite get the A. Well, let's just start with this first. So what is like, what's thinking with emotions? Because isn't thinking separate from emotions? Like I can understand that you might, well, I guess rationalization is thinking, isn't it? Isn't that a form of thought?
Yeah, that's
And
more what I mean. I didn't mean literally using emotion to think, rather like
yeah.
using emotions as justifications or
Okay.
basis or something like that. Using that in your to come to conclusions as in a like
Right.
using that information as sufficient as the emotional connection is proof in itself. Like if it makes you feel mad, it's a bad thing. But that'd be subjective. It's like just because you feel mad at something doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing. It just means you feel mad. You couldn't just conclude that you're feeling that way means it does that for everyone or something like that. You couldn't do that. You're not using that feeling as proof of how things are or proof of the facts of reality.
So then thinking, I mean, yeah, we know thinking can be either rational or irrational. And then the thing that differentiates irrational from irrational thought, well, irrational thought, I mean, we can only go by what? Reason, which is confusing here because that's part of thought. So reason or emotion. Those are basic two alternatives. So then if we have an irrational thought, that would mean that somewhere in that thought, there is some emotion-based product. Is that what we're saying? And then if you have if it's rational, if there's nothing in there that's not, that's based on, I don't know if that's a good thing, but I'm trying not to use the thing I learned from objectivism, which is like you validate it through reduction to the perceptual level or whatever. But so irrational thought is one that includes some kind of emotion-based product, like a concept. Do you think that's?
I mean, I would say at least it's just to say something is rational first. I mean, you're just identifying it as it's a method that seeks to find the truth. Like, and that an implicit within that is that there's a right way to find the truth and a wrong way, or at least a better way and a worse way. And that's all rationality would say. If it's rational, I mean, at least on the most basic level, before all these things we might discover about what it is and all that, we'd start by understanding that like something brings you to the truth or it doesn't. Either helps bring you there or it doesn't. There's no third option. Like there's no like law of excluded middle. It's either it goes towards the truth or it doesn't.
You're saying, didn't you say irrational thinking before? Are you saying that's
irrational? Not? I only say irrational because an individual might take an action that you wouldn't call irrational per se, because it's not bringing you maybe away from truth, but you don't regard it as in anything. You regard it as nothing, perhaps.
What do you mean?
Like you might irrational, or maybe irrational would be better than irrational in this context, because you were just talking about things just that aren't rational, or it's irrelevant whether it is or isn't.
But then there wouldn't be any thinking that's irrational or irrational. Like I get, you might have a sneeze is irrational, but thinking, like I can't see the.
Yeah, as far as thoughts, I think you're probably right, but I think really the main point is that either thought is rational or not. That's all you really need to think of it. Either is or isn't.
Yep. Okay.
And I think that's the only way you subdivide thought. You subdivide thoughts into rational or irrational thoughts.
So then most of my thoughts are irrational because I haven't gone through a process of necessarily validating and reducing each concept that I use. And if a lot of them are misty and vague, then the only thing dictating their use is emotion and association, right? So I'm for the most part characterized by irrational thinking, which sounds absurd to say. But I don't think that's fully true, but there's something there. I don't.
You would say to a degree, you are irrational, but to a degree you're not.
Yeah, I agree with that.
You are rational. I mean, I think that's all it's really saying, that some of your concepts might be irrational, or if that's too strong of a judgment in your eyes, it's nothing. It's cognitively meaningless. There might be another way to see it. Like either your thoughts help you think better, or they help identify the truth, or they don't. And some might not help. You might not say they're irrational, but not necessarily, but you say they're not serving a rational function. They're not doing anything. They're not. It's just like taking up space for no reason. Things like that.
Yeah, there's probably I'm getting confused with like you can arrive to a concept by mistake. Like even differentiating emotion and thought is not an automatic thing. And so you can arrive to concepts by mistake, but would you say the person is irrational? Probably not. Like potentially they just didn't.
I usually think it would depend on their intention. Like they might be honestly trying the best they can to find a rational answer. I mean, they could end up at the wrong answer, and that's what I mean. You can call it like not rational. The answer isn't like oh, we can disregard it now that I see why it's irrational, or I see why it's incorrect. And sometimes there could be overlap there, something being incorrect could be irrational. But I guess it depends on, are you trying to judge what the person is, or are you trying to judge the particular idea? Because you
Trying
might
to
look at the
judge
person.
myself.
Okay,
Like
then I would just say like,
not in terms of I'm a good or bad person, just out of pure curiosity. Like, well,
yeah.
how do you, if we're talking about irrational and rational
I
thoughts,
mean,
like,
at first I would think about like, what methods were you trying to use in the first place? Like, did you make a mistake on one step, or did you habitually like throw off reason and use some other method, like I don't know, some radical skepticism to come to your conclusion? And that would be different than it's like, you could either reject any concepts as like, be skeptical of everything and question every single thought you possibly can with no certainty, and you could say that that's why you reach a certain conclusion. Clearly that's worse than saying like, oh, I misidentified something, or I maybe abstracted a bit too much and I need to concretize it a bit more. I mean, clearly the violation one's much worse than the other.
too bad. I mean, I don't think I'm going to get an answer to what I'm thinking about. I probably need to formulate the question better, but like, it would be really amazing if you could, we're not going to ever see this, but like you could map out the conceptual organization of, say, Newton's brain and someone else's, and just see if it does come down to that, or in terms of like productive achievement, if it comes down to conceptual organization, or if it comes down to the ability to retain certain observations through memory and then make comparisons, like, oh, that happened, like I mentioned before, like, yeah, that thing and that thing and that thing spread out over like 3 months, because maybe that's where it's sometimes you're not able to get the material and organize it in such a way that you can properly come up with concepts, but also validate them, if that makes sense. So I don't think I'm going to get my answer. Like, I'm not going to know. I can sit here and, I'm recording these sessions, so we'll see. Like, I can sit here and I can spend 2 months trying to reorganize my concepts, and then I'll find out a few years later. But otherwise, you don't know. It just doesn't seem to be an answer to it. So
yeah, on some level, you're not going to always find that answer because it is such a deep question. I mean, but it's not like if you have a hard time with one, doesn't mean like the whole thing is destabilized and doesn't work. I mean, clearly
that's
there's
the
a benefit.
question. Yeah.
There's a benefit to the organization, and it does help retain things. Like, in a way, it is the memory. Like, memory is better retention and better organization. So they are the same thing in a way. To remember
Right.
better is to organize better. There isn't really much of a difference. At least under objectivism, I don't think there is. I think to remember would be to have your concepts organized well. Like, I think they're the same thing.
Yeah. Although, yeah, maybe there's definitely a relationship between the two. But I'm thinking of, because I've been thinking a lot more about this since reading this Ito, and then the first chapter of, um, what was it, Understanding Objectivism. Like, I'm completely trying to change the way I think, and like, I'll remember certain things. I'm like, oh, that's interesting, I've seen that before, and I will remember something else, but I'll lose the details. And so then I thought, like, okay, well, if I could retain the details really well, that's what that person said. Oh, and that connects to this thing this other person says. Then suddenly you are in a much better position. But if you can't retain it, which a lot of the time, especially when things are spread out over a long period of time, like, because existence is implicit in everything, but some concepts aren't. They're spread out. You have to see this phenomena a few times. And so if you can't retain it, then I can see how suddenly you're not necessarily going to form as many concepts as someone else who does retain way more. But there's no answer there, I think. I don't.
I mean, not no. I don't think philosophy would necessarily answer that. Like, maybe things like, how do you, so in what way do you write down notes and things like that? I mean,
Right.
that can be in a way to help. But I know what you're saying. It's not. I don't think philosophy really answers that. I'm not aware of how philosophy could. I mean, that gets into special science, I think.
Right. I think you're right. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, I guess it's an ongoing experiment, hey, with all these tutorials.
I like the way you phrase that though. Like, how to compare and find out. Like, I think you could find that out with some psychology experiments, and especially the way I want to study psychology, because I want to see how concepts are organized and what are the rational ways. Or usually in psychology, it is thought of as like rational computation, things like that, like where you take the observations around you, integrate it with your prior knowledge to come up with new knowledge, which is basically what objectivism says. But they do it through computer models usually
Right.
to see. I mean, they would in some way map out how concepts are organized, and then you could compare how well they function in some, say, word experiment. Like, how well do they retain words, or how fast can they solve a word problem? I mean,
Got
that'd
it.
be one way you could analyze that thing. But you're right, that's a difficult question to answer. Like, that's some pretty advanced stuff.
Okay. And then I guess the other part I think you mentioned before was like, yeah, if you change some fundamental concepts, even if you don't hold them explicitly before, but you do now, and you change the way you use them and they do a lot of work in your thinking, what happens? I don't know either for that. So,
Yeah.
okay. This is, I might as well ask you this another random thing. Do you know of like, I don't have a word for this conceptually. It's actually in fiction. And it's really interesting because a friend was telling me she had a similar experience, and it's from psychology. That is, I'm sure there's a concept in psychology, but I cannot. I'll try to find it for you. I call it the principle of the chinless samurai, but um, let me see. I might screen share and then we can go through this together.
Sure.
You may not know what this is because it's a bit random, but on the chance that you do. Okay, I will share my Kindle. Where is it? Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
All right, so there's been some samurai who was drawing a picture of the castle, and then he was chased down by workers because some workmen accused him of being a spy, and they're like throwing rocks at him and stuff. And anyway, so he's 90% dead. We might as well leave him here till the magistrate comes. And then he spotted this guy called Matahachi, who's just a worker, but he's a character in the book. And then he's describing how Matahachi is like, his head could not quite take in either their import or the meaning of the event he had just witnessed. It all seemed like a nightmare, visible to his eyes, audible to his ears, but not comprehensible to his brain. Like, this guy has just randomly had rocks thrown at him after being accused of being a spy, after he was just drawing the castle. He says, life's so flimsy. A few minutes ago, he was absorbed in his sketching. Now he's dying. He wasn't very old. He felt sorry for the chinless samurai, whose head, lying sideways on the ground, was black with dirt and gore, his face contorted with anger. The rope anchored him to a large rock. Let me just see if I can skip the grotesqueness of this. Okay. Poor wretch, thought Matahachi. If he was studying seriously, he must have had some great ambition in life. Wonder where he's from, if his parents are still alive. Matahachi was seized by a peculiar doubt. Was he really bemoaning the man's fate, or was he bothered by the vagueness of his own future? For a man with ambition, he reflected, there ought to be a cleverer way to get ahead. And so the point is, like, he's got all this concern for the person, but it's not concern for the person. It's concern for himself and what the event means for himself. And the reason why I'm like, is there a name for this? Because I've got a friend and she's an amputee, and she's young, and she'll often have people ask her like, what happened to her leg, and she would realize it's often out of concern for themselves, like, so they can look out and, like, it's not that they're necessarily genuinely interested in like what happened to her, but they're concerned about themselves, like, how can I not lose my leg or whatever it is. And so, do you know what I'm saying? That's the same idea of like,
Yeah.
the person is asking you these questions which seem weird, or like they're taking concern in you, but it's actually concern for themselves.
It sounds familiar. I can't think of a name for it either, but I feel like
Okay.
there is. I'm not, at least not in English that I can think of.
Is there in a different language?
Not that I know of, but
Yeah,
usually there's
okay.
some things like that. Like if it's not in English, it's still in another language. Like emotions are like that. Like one language doesn't have a word for it, but
Maybe we
other
need a
languages.
concept for it since we could have form a concept for it.
Yeah.
But I guess that's the process of concept formation, right? Like you look at stuff and you're like, I've seen that before, where someone is asking you a question, inquires,
Yes.
and has this concern. And then the concern is, or you do, I've done that too. Like where I'm like interested in something that happened and I realize it's more about me than the person. Like it's a concern for myself. Like you read about a murder and you're like, oh my God, how did this person get murdered? I don't want to get murdered. And so you're like,
Yeah.
you read, it's the same idea, but I don't have a word for it. So
Yeah, I can't think of a word, but it definitely seems like a
but that
word
might
that,
be the beginning of concept formation, right? You observe, you've
yes, I
seen that
agree.
before. Okay, cool.
I agree.
That's pretty cool.
Like, and if
Um,
you see it enough times, like, hey, maybe I should find one word for it. And when you mention that, it does seem like a very useful thing to think of. Like, I think I've seen that enough times to
me
want a
too.
word for it.
I've seen that in myself too. Like if something bad happens to someone, I'm suddenly really concerned. But after reading this, I realized it's concern for myself, like concern that
Yeah.
something will happen to me.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, I have Ito here if you want to go into that.
Sure.
Okay, cool. Oh. Yep. We were talking about, we got caught on um, this on so you only, the CCD is content and action, but you can only measure one aspect of the, you can't measure all the CCD content. You can only measure, one aspect of it.
I mean, I was saying that you can measure both. I mean, context is more like degree of abstraction and action being intensity.
One sec. Action is intensity.
Yes. And
Oh,
content
okay.
would be like abstractness.
But then what about the intensity of a psychological process is the automatically summed up result of many factors: scope, clarity, cognitive and motivational context. So those things aren't measured. So it's a sum of many factors, but only some of those factors are measurable. Is that what we're saying?
I don't see why they wouldn't be. I mean, there could just be a um, not ordinal, but what's the other word? Well, it's still more and less than cardinal. You have comparisons of degree of clarity or more clear and less clear. Motivational context. I'm not sure. But I mean, Rand's arguing that they're measurable in some way. I don't know
Yeah.
if it
Okay.
quite matters as much as there's a on or off thing, like it is. It's abstract or it's not, or there is kind of, but there's a measurement in some way. The only thing I was confused about why she said the CCD is 2 feet, 2 attributes. It was odd, and I reread it too. In context, it was weird. Like she said, um, I mean, it's fine that there could be more than one CCD, but it was weird that she used it singular when she was referring to two, and I didn't know how to interpret it.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Me too.
She did that.
I still don't know. Is that
A CCD should be one or close to it. That much I'm sure about. Like
yeah?
it's almost at least one, maybe two, not too many. and it is an essential, more or less. And distinguishing just meant, yeah, it is an essential too. The CCD is distinguishing. The only reason she used CCD over distinguishing is in that context. So let me just take a step back here. What she meant by distinguishing characteristic and why she didn't just say CCD. So a distinguishing characteristic is just something that isn't essential, or something that makes it very distinct and unique and not anything else is what differentiates it from other things. So, I mean, tables, they're their distinguishing features being a flat surface with four legs. I mean, their shape is distinguishing, or their particular kind of shape is distinguishing among other furniture. Like it was in the context of furniture. So a bed has one shape, a chair has another.
Yeah.
They both have a distinguishing characteristic. And to go up from chair and bed to furniture, you're taking their distinguishing characteristics, which is the particular shape of a chair and a particular shape of a bed, and saying those, then the distinguishing characteristic of furniture is the CCD, which is shape. So you got the shape of the bed and the shape of the chair.
Say that
that's
again. The
omitted
distinguishing characteristic of what
of furniture
is
shape, and that's the CCD.
Of furniture. Of furniture. The distinguishing characteristic.
Or
yeah, you got it.
I should say
confused.
the CCD is the one shared among the constituents of furniture.
Right.
That's what I mean to say. So
that's
it's not
I got
just
that.
distinguishing about the individuals, but the distinguishing thing in common, and that's the feature we use to identify furniture, like, or at least that's what they're integrated on. They're integrated. Their shape is abstracted away.
And so yeah, I mean, I got my head around. So when you form wider categories, that's when you omit the distinguishing characteristic, and you have to find, like, you have to look and think and find a commensurable characteristic, which he calls a CCD. But when you're subdividing, that's when there's no, is there, I don't know if there's a CCD. You just specify what?
Yeah, we're just reading this too. Let me find exactly what she said. She did mention that specifically. Let's see. I was looking at this. So her example was table. We're just going to go over what I read here. So integrating concepts, she's talking about table, chair, or wait, which word did she use? She was using, let me see which one. Door, window, picture, drapes. Those are the, and say we take table. Wait, what is, hold on. I was reading the wrong one. Table, chair, bed, cabinet. So she's saying the distinguishing characteristics of these units, for example, are a flat level surface and supports, which would be table. And in relation to the new concept, these distinguishing characteristics are now regarded in the same manner as the measurements of individual. Well, it's on page 20 of Ito. And
do you have location on the Kindle? Oh, I could probably, the page will be different. 343. Okay. Right. So she talks about going to a wider concept, in which case
Yeah.
a CCD is picked, which is the movable man-made objects, and then you intend it to be used in a human habitation and so on, but she omits the distinguishing characteristic of the specifics that were originally there, like of table, the distinguishing characteristic was shape.
Yeah.
Let's see. Then we're talking about subdividing. So
Yeah. So subdividing is
there we go, subdividing table.
its shape is retained.
Yeah, so differentiation. So the distinguishing characteristic is retained, but it's differentiated purely in terms of measurement. That's so it's a measurement of the distinguishing characteristic. So there's no use of the CCD. So I think I was right.
Yeah. It's not the CCD you're using
No.
for
Well,
that for
the concept isn't
subdividing.
applicable. I don't think the concept is applicable in that context, if I got it correctly.
CCD, yeah. I
Yeah.
don't think it's really applicable because you're not integrating multiple instances of a type into a wider category. I mean, this is you're taking the category as it is and just you're not breaking apart the category as much as just making finer distinctions of the
Right.
measurements.
Right. She does later say, I just scroll down. Once you've subdivided, then the original distinguishing characteristic is taken as the CCD of the subdivided concept. So that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay. Did we? I just looked over this now. By the way, this thing with content and action. Did we? I can't remember what you said. Sorry, because maybe I was lost. It took my brain a while to catch up on what I was thinking. But because I read content and action, and then she says content and intensity. But is intensity like a kind of action? Wait, no. Intensity is an attribute of action. So it's like the CCD is content and the CCD is action. But the measurable, you can't measure the CCD. You can only measure an attribute of the CCD action. Do I have that right? Because it seems really confusing.
Let me see this.
Did what I say make sense?
Kind of, I mean.
Because here's how my brain's thinking of it. CCD1, I'm thinking of them as separate, is content. CCD2 is action. But in this case, she says the measurable attributes, you can't measure action directly. You have to measure intensity. You can't measure action. You can only measure intensity. So then that means you can't measure this CCD. You can only measure an attribute of it. Or I'm just trying to work out what.
I'm just trying to figure out where you got that. She's saying you can't measure the action. Or I would.
I think she says, yeah, the measurable attributes of a psychological process are its object or content and its intensity. And so she obviously didn't say you measure action, you just measure intensity of action, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, action doesn't necessarily tell you like what about action you're measuring or what it is you could observe or measure. I mean, I think she's saying you observe actions and you measure with intensity. I mean, that's how I understand it.
Right. So you can have a CCD that you can't measure. Well, I'm not sure if I'm thinking about this properly.
I mean, you're measuring the intensity. The CCD is these units are the fundamental constituent.
Oh yeah, okay. I guess you're right. Yeah, you're measuring the intensity of the action. That's yeah, okay. Not sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's all I take it as. What you're measuring about action is intensity.
Right.
I mean, you are measuring the action.
Yeah.
By means of intensity.
And then content by means of scope.
Yes.
What about all of this stuff? Like all these other Oh wait, no, this is what intensity is. Intensity sums up all of this stuff: scope, clarity,
Yeah.
cognitive. Okay. Um, But content you can measure directly. Like you can go anger, happiness, sadness. Is that what is meant by that?
I think so. Just as far as it's, yeah, something to that effect. Or,
Okay.
for instance, to form content, so isolate the action from the content. Um,
It's weird to use the word measurement for it.
it's kind of both the same. Like by taking the action, it necessarily has a content. You can't have content. You can't have consciousness or a state of consciousness without content.
Right.
So whatever the intensity is, it's always of something,
Yes.
and that's part of what she's saying.
Okay.
And what it's of is depends on is something of varying degrees of abstraction or scope. I think they'd be very much similar. Like the wider the scope, the more abstract it is.
Yeah.
Things like that. And that will be present in all states of consciousness.
Okay. I'll probably need to sit and go over this one again
Yeah. I
a
mean,
bit
it
more.
really just she's saying you can't just think and have no content. You can't just have a thought absent of anything. Like there'd be a contradiction. I mean, that's what she says right in the start.
I think she later. I asked here when I got to this like the scope of an emotion, like the scope of anger, but I do think she says later that there's a different method for emotions. So yeah, I think she separates measuring cognitive and then measuring evaluative, which is
Yes.
emotion. So maybe we can
Yes.
um, skip this, put that blue for later. All right. And then, so if we're talking about scope of this, how would you think of that in terms of these factors: clarity, cognitive and motivational context, the degree of mental energy? Yeah.
I mean, how would I measure it?
Well, how would
When
you
I'm
think of
asked,
it? I just, you don't have to, I'm
okay.
not asking for an answer. Like, how would you think of like, um,
Um,
I guess that is measurement. If I'm asking you to think of intensity in terms of scope, clarity, cognitive and motivational context, like,
I mean, I would say like relatively low clarity. When I'm angry, it's not always clear what it's about, just that I'm feeling it. So it's kind of low clarity, high motivation. Like I really want to act out. Low cognitive context, like I'm not really thinking out at the time. Like I'm angry because of this reason, and this makes me upset because it goes against my values. Like it's not so cognitive. It's like
right.
more reaction. So it's not much cognitive stuff there. Mental
Oh,
energy high because like I want to get my energy out. Like I want to yell or something. Like high energy. Effort kind of in the middle. Doesn't It's not hard to let your anger out. It's almost really easy. Like that feeling like it's easy to let yourself just go off the handle and just scream. It's
that's,
harder to take it easy and just calm yourself. So not
yeah.
much effort even to be angry.
I was actually asking for rationality, grasping rationality
Okay.
versus existence. But I'm actually
Okay.
I'm happy you answered that one because that's really interesting. Like I didn't even think to ask about that, but like
Yeah.
in those terms. But then I realized when you said that, like, okay, if you're really angry, you've got a lot of mental energy. So it actually I can suddenly see if you've got like to increase mental energy, you can be really emotional about something, not over the top, like there's Yerkes Dodson or whatever, but like if you can increase your emotion, it kind of connects to that, relates to that idea. It actually helps you achieve more knowledge, and then that also relates to when we covered some of the theory of art, we were saying like art is like it concretizes an abstraction and provides you with fuel to be able to grasp it in like a single concrete and embodied form. So
Yes.
maybe you could make the argument that art helps productivity because it increases your ability to think, because that's a bit of a
Yeah.
stretch. But like the degree, if the degree of your mental energy is contributes to the intensity of a thought process, and you just gave the example of anger, which I just thought
Yeah.
of now, then that would mean, yeah, this seems like an almost, I mean, yeah, I guess emotion is one aspect of degree of mental energy, maybe. I don't know, but that makes me think of like, you need to be really emotional to think well.
Yeah. I mean, there is a value in it. There's something there for it. It does something, and we're also distinguishing that here. I can answer the rationality question too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, please.
I
I
would just
guess
say,
motivational context is relevant there too. So,
I would just clarify rational thinking is how I'm thinking the question. What is the intensity of rational thinking? Or what's the range of intensity here? So at first I think with scope, usually pretty wide, long range, not just like in the frame of like just the next 5 minutes. Usually it's in the frame of a long span of time, perhaps in your lifetime, or just long term. Clarity usually between middle and high, because you could have low clarity when you begin thinking about something, but once you're thinking at the as much rationality as you can, it'll be very clear. Cognitive high, because you really try thinking directly and slowly, but deliberately. Motivational, maybe like perhaps high motivation because you're finding reasons to do things, or that might make it difficult. So maybe mid-range motivational, degree of mental energy, maybe on the middle end. It can take, you might want to think quickly, but it's not the same way as like when you're excited and effort required high, because you need to slowly and volitionally put these things together, like make the connections, like what you experienced when you started studying this. It's definitely a lot
right.
of effort compared to say when you're angry.
Cool. That was for rationality. All right, let's